Hello and welcome to another new episode of Leading with Women by EgoMock. Joining us today is Kelli McLoud-Schingen. She is the President and Principal Facilitator for KMS Intercultural Consulting LLC. She has been a strong advocate and champion of intercultural inclusion since 1989. Her areas of expertise span inclusive leadership, storytelling, cultural competence, social justice, healing racism, conflict resolution, and team building. She has been responsible for implementing strategies for inclusion and cultural competence across education as well as multinational institutions. Thank you so much for joining us, Kelli.
It is truly my pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking.
So, Kelli, I would first like to just set context with you.
Okay.
With all these heightened tensions around with the Black Lives Matter protests, I would like to ask you, what is the business case for racial equity?
Oh, well, that's a big question, but I think that what it really is about is that there are just simply no more second-class citizens. People don't want to be considered less than. They don't want to have to feel like they have to consider where it is that they're going. So what you'll find is that people will shop their consciousness. So if someone feels as if a company is, let's just say, for example, if you feel like your company matches your environmental issues or your political ideology, then you will begin finding those companies and organizations that match your belief system. And so the business case really is about relevance. If you want to remain relevant, if you want to make sure that you are creating that culture, that community of people who are you can always rely on to shop with you, to spend their money with you, to invest in you, then I believe that it is in their best interest to make sure that they are being mindful and have their finger on the pulse of racial equity, particularly as it's become it's always been a global phenomenon, but it is people across the globe right now are not standing for feeling like they are second-class citizens. So, if the support is there, then people are putting their money where their mouth is and where their issues are.
So on one hand, even though we're seeing, as you said, a heightened support and awareness, we also see this other side of it, right? Where in order to fit in with the white culture, we tend to adopt mannerisms. So in this, how are we empowered when we embrace our own culture?
Honestly, this is very personal, isn't it? And it depends on people's experience, right? I think I can probably use my own experience as an example. So my journey to embrace my own culture began when I realized that I was enough, but it took me a long time to get there. I wrote this story some years ago called Anything But Black, and it was my experience about growing up in a community that was all African American, but we constantly had images of people who did not look like us, that beauty did not look like our own beauty, that brilliance did not look like us. And so for a long time, I think I chased after how I could potentially be like everybody else. So it took me some really painful experiences to go through. But when I stepped into the fullness of myself, and that included my Blackness, it included my Americanness and my Black Americanness, I truly never felt more complete and more proud. And so I really believe that we feel empowered, we feel stronger not just because we've stepped into the fullness of ourselves, but that we can look around at people who look like us and feel proud to be a part of that culture and that community.
But to reach at that point, you said that you had to go through some painful experiences. Do you think it's a necessity to go through something heart-wrenching and painful to have that kind of self-awareness?
That's a brilliant question. And I have to say that I have had a friend of mine who asked me this question years ago. He was a white male. And he said, Kelly, can't I be empathetic and can't I be a supporter without having to be broken down to the, very bottom in
Yeah.
order to understand the experience? And I think that there it is difficult, frankly, to really know how it feels unless you have experienced that. And so finding that moment to be proud is deeply impacted by your experiences. Does that make sense? Because if I grew up in an environment where everything around me supported, upheld, lifted me up, and I was the norm, there would be nothing to overcome, right?
No, it's absolutely understandable. So, because you said that since in different communities these people are going through a stage where they feel like second class citizens, there's been so much hatred and pain caused by racial injustices. How and when do you think
Mm.
communities begin healing?
I truly believe that the process of healing begins with listening. And specifically, when the members of a dominant community are willing to be better story listeners. And that means that they have to be willing to listen to those experiences of people who have had, deep pain behind oppression and discrimination. But while they're listening, it's not just pain porn. I hate to use that type of language, but it's not just something for you to say, "Oh, that's so terrible. I feel so sorry," and live in a space of guilt. But what they need to be doing is listening for ways that they can make a difference in their own spheres of influence, right? So in their homes, in their schools, in their workplaces, in their places of, worship. Um, so they need to be listening for ways that they can be part of the solution, right? Not just to feel bad. And the power to create racial harmony lies, I believe, at the hands of those who stand to lose the most by creating that harmony, right? It takes bravery. And the marginalized have been finding ways to deal with injustices for generations. And many of the ways that marginalized people have done that is through story, through the power of story. Mhm.
I think now that we are attempting to celebrate a person because of their history, because of their story, because of what they've been through, I would really like our viewers to know about your live, which you do on
Mm.
Facebook, which is known as Stories of Inclusion. So I would really like to ask you, what is that one takeaway that you got from doing these lives and asking people their stories?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. One of the reasons why I started it was because I felt like I knew some really fascinating people whose stories were, just rich, and that there was so much that they could offer people, just talking about what does it take to create spaces of inclusion. And it was a Facebook Live. We're not charging anybody for it. So of course it's free. So, these are people who get a bunch of money, to do their work and to tell their stories. But what I discovered was that everybody has a story, first of all, right? We all do. But that what I really discovered was that people have a desire to share it. They want to talk about what they've learned and how their life has brought them to where it is that they are. So the first thing is that everyone has a story and wants to share it. I think that the other one is that, one of my favorite quotes is the shortest distance between two people or two strangers is a story. And so what I find is that when people start telling their stories, even if I know them incredibly well, I become even closer to them because I'm discovering things that I didn't know, ways that we are even closer, and even some things that I couldn't possibly imagine that that was their experience, and I have nothing to to reference in my own life about their particular experience, but it brought me closer because I had a greater understanding of them and their experience, what they overcame, um, and then what they do, right?
You have been telling us so much about how what incredible value story holds. So you started the World Stage Theatre Company in 2017 with a specific mission of greater representation and telling stories that throw light on social issues. So tell us, how powerful is storytelling as a tool?
Mm. Thank you for asking that question too. I didn't realize you knew about the theater company. I have to say that, I chased Broadway dreams for a really long time, but I believe that I was truly called to do, diversity, equity, and inclusion, intercultural work. And so I always used story in the work that I was doing. So when I started feeling like it was time for me to retire and give space for the younger generation to do the intercultural work, I thought, what do I want to do with my time and what do I love that would fulfill me in the same way? And it was theater. And I feel strongly that there is no more powerful tool to foster empathy and compassion than a story. And then when you have the story before you, whether it's in film or in theater, you can't help but connect with the teller. They could be completely different from you. They could be even, some of the television shows now, or even some of the plays are doing things like telling you the story of the wicked witch of the east, right? And so, but they're giving you their perspective. They're giving you the witch's perspective, and now you don't hate her anymore because you begin to feel compassion and empathy because you're walking through her side of the story, right? And so when you have an opportunity to demonstrate that, then when the hero is happy, you're happy. When they're sad, they're sad. We pull for them. So I think we did, I think that the reason why I wanted to do it in theater, as I said, was because I felt like we needed to have more conversations about different cultural experiences. And theater is a way to do it that's not intrusive. So it doesn't ask Kelly to tell her story, or it doesn't ask Rahi to tell her story. What it does is puts the story in front of people, and then you're all in a space together. There's also been research that shows that when the audience engages in theater, that their hearts begin to sync and they begin to beat together at the same time. It's just an amazing experience of community and connection. And so I just simply don't think that there's anything more powerful than that. Yeah, you yeah, you're not gonna find me saying anything other than theater is my favorite tool. Even as an interculturalist, it was always theater to bring people together.
You speak about theater beautifully. And what I get from that is that you really want people to know both sides of the story, right? You cannot have narratives from only one perspective. So, in this, what are some crucial insights that you would like to share with our viewers when fostering the use of conscious language?
Ooh, you know what? I think if we lead, if you lead in every communication with every person who you come into contact with the desire to connect, then I think that you will always find conscious language as your choices, right? I think that the words that you choose will always be mindful of how you are staying in connection with the person who is in front of you. So you won't use toxic language, you won't use divisive language, you won't use judgmental language, right? Your desire would always be at the core to connect. So that's what I think are critical. And then the other one is the current inclusive language is not comprehensive, and sometimes that inclusive language can even be divisive. It makes people a little bit uncomfortable. So when you say things like, white privilege, whether or not the concept is factual, it puts people on defense, or white fragility, right? It puts people on defense. And so it is, I won't say inaccurate, but it is language that is not as inclusive as, we want to have these conversations. And again, whether the concepts are true, people begin to not want to connect with that concept because it puts them on defense. So I think that we have to be also willing to adjust and adapt our language to make sure that we are communicating and it is being received in the spirit in which it's intended. So that is at the heart of fostering conscious language, is always having at the core of it the desire to connect and to keep people at the table for the conversations that can be difficult.
No, definitely. Something interesting which I would really like to engage on is you said that we should not be using terms and specifically mentioned the terms white privilege. But we often see in society, and especially I would talk about in my society, we often do use white privilege as a very privilege, definitely white privilege, even more so. So, what
Right.
do you mean when you
I
say
think
we
that
should
we
not
can,
lead with that?
I think that we can try to figure out ways to, I'm not saying dance around it, right? Because I think that the concept is just, the concept is real. I think that we need to begin to have the conversation from the perspective of what it provides versus, you know, um, to deal deeply in what the word is. So when we talk about privilege, what do we mean when we say that, right? Um, so the Pecky McIntosh Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, Uncovering White Privilege was the article that kicked off that language. What she offered was 50 different statements on how white privilege shows up. And I feel like if we can lead with many of those statements on the way that it shows up, then people begin to say, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Oh, is that what you mean? Ah, okay, now I see." Because the word privilege makes people think that we're talking about financial or economic privilege, right? So it's easy for some people to dismiss what what their role is in fostering it if they didn't grow up wealthy. Does that make sense?
So, as a final question after a very enlightening conversation, we would really like to know what do you see in the next phase for you?
Hmm. Ooh, that's a big one. So I think that for me, I have about 5 books on my desk, on my laptop, that are in progress and have been for the last 15 plus years. Um, so I think that ultimately I'd like to write that book about how our language limits us, particularly around this culturally conscious, you know, connections, really. And so I'd like to offer first the ways that it disconnects and then make some recommendations on what we can do to connect. Of course, story is a big part of that. And then the other part is I think that I'm just going to spend a lot more time with the theater company to build it, to take it to number more places, to grow the company, um, and to try to make it much more of a common connection with people here in Tulsa, but also in other parts of the world. So I'd like to be able to grow our coffers, our bank accounts, so that we can get around and see and do much more. Um, so that we can just bring people together. I think that that's at the heart of it is making those human connections.
I really hope you're successful with both these endeavors, and I can't wait to read your book. Thank you so much for joining us again, Kelly.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I really appreciate the invite.